There are a couple more things I want you to know before we get into positioning. Let's start with the concepts of inheritance, specificity, and placement of the styles. Sometimes we will find that there are different selectors affecting the same HTML element. If this is the case, with those concepts here, we are going to be able to know which is the CSS rule that is going to be applied to a specific HTML element. Let's talk about inheritance. Some CSS properties, especially the ones styling text and lists, affect the descendant elements. Here, for example, we have a div with the ID outer, to which we are applying a CSS rule that sets the color to red. That means that all the elements inside that outer div are going to be red, because all the children elements are inheriting the property color from the parent. If we want any of those children elements to be on a different color, we will need to set a CSS rule that is more specific, like for example that one, outer H2. This CSS rule sets the color to blue for any H2 element inside an element with the outer ID, and it is more specific than just using outer as the selector. Let's talk a little more about the specificity, because this is something very important in order to make sure that we are applying the styles we want to a specific element. When there are two rules applied to the same elements, you have to remember that the more specific rule takes precedence over the less specific one. And how can we know which rule is more specific? Well, there are basically two things that determine the specificity of a selector. One is the type of selector, and the other one is if the elements are chained. If the selector is a chain of different selectors. We'll see that in a second. Regarding the type of selector, this is what you have to remember. Class selector is more specific than the element selector, and the ID selector is more specific than a class selector. So a CSS rule that has an ID as a selector is going to take precedence over a CSS rule whose selector is a class or an element. What we have here is an example of chain selector. What we do is that we point to the element we want to style by chaining selectors. Let's see one more example. We have this HTML code here and this class. And this is how this is going to be rendered. The H3 element inside box is going to be pink, but not the other H3 elements that our page might have, because this selector is only affecting the H3 element inside box. Okay? And the rest of the elements are going to be displayed black, which is the default color. Now, what if we want to add another P element, apple, and we want it to be blue? How can we do that? There are basically two things we can do here. We can use a chain selector, or we can add a class to the element and create a CSS rule using that class as a selector. And this is what I'm going to do here. I'm creating the main class and adding that class to the P elements, to the last P element inside the box div. If we wanted to use a chain selector here, what would that be? Right, box P last of type, or box P last child. Why? Because we are selecting only one of all the P elements inside box, and that one is the last one. So we need to specify that is this exactly P element, the one we want to select, and we can do that using the last type or the last child selector. And now let's talk about the placement of the CSS rule, because when two rules have the same specificity, the place where they are created is important in order to determine which one is going to be applied. If the CSS rules are added in the same CSS file, then the one that is added below the other is the one that takes precedence. However, if they are added in different ways, for example, one is an inline style and the other one is added as an external CSS file, then the one that is closest to the element is the one that is going to be applied. That means that a rule added as an internal style will override one added in an external CSS file, and one that is added as an inline style will override the other two. One last thing regarding which property is going to be applied in case of conflict, and this is the important mark. Any CSS property mark with important is going to be applied regardless of its location or its specificity. It is going to override any other property. In that case, any element with the class custom is going to be green. It doesn't matter if there are other properties that are more specific or are placed in better position. Any property that is conflicting with that one is going to be overridden by this one. And this is it for inheritance, specificity, and placement of the styles. Let's now move to the last two things I'm going to show you before we get into positioning. Those things are the box model and the display property. We already know that HTML elements are boxes and that those boxes have a content, hello in this case, and that we can add style to those boxes. There are some style properties that affect the box itself, not the content, the appearance of the content, but the box. Those are the height, the width, the padding, the border, and the margin. Besides the height and the width, there are other properties. There are other things that affects the box. Those are the padding. The padding is what separates the content from the border. Then we have the border, that it's an element that can be visible because it can have a size and a color and even a style. We can make it a solid line or dots or dashes. The border is like the limit of the element. After that, what we have is the margin, but the margin is not part of the element itself. It's more that the space that is going to separate the element from the element that is above, below, or on the sides. When we set the width and height of an element, what we are setting is the width and height of the content, only the content, not the whole box. It doesn't include the padding, the margin, or the border. This is the default behavior, but can be changed using the box sizing property. You may be thinking, is that important? Yes, let me show you why. Let's say we have this HTML code here and those classes. The div with the outer class is going to display a box with a gray background and a width of 500 pixels. But then we have some content inside here. We have another div with the inner class. This div has a width of 100%, but it also has a padding, a border, and a margin. So what do you think is going to happen here? Right, the inner box is going to overflow the outer one. The total width of the inner box is going to be 500 pixels for the width of the parent, plus 15 pixels on each side for the padding, and 5 pixels on each side for the border. We do not add here the size of the margin because the margin is always outside the box. We never take it into account when calculating the width or the height of an element. As I said before, this is the default behavior. This default behavior is set by the default value of the box sizing property, which is content box. We can change that default behavior by setting the box sizing property to border box. And this is what we are going to do here. Let's add that property to the inner class, and this is what is going to happen. The inner content is going to fit the parent. It's not going to overflow the outer element anymore. This happens because now the width of the element contains not only the width of the content, but also the padding and the border. Not the margin, remember. And we are done with the box model. Let's now see the display property. There is another characteristic of HTML elements that is very important in terms of how and where they are displayed in the screen. This characteristic is whether they are block elements or inline elements. Some examples of block elements are the P, the div, and the li. By default, those elements tend to expand to fill the width of their container. They tend to have 100% of the width of the parent by default, and they stack vertically. They are displayed one below the other. To those elements, we can apply the margins, padding, height, and width properties. Let's see an example. Here we have 3 block elements. By default, they have a width of 100% of the width of the parent, and they stack vertically. We can give them some CSS properties. Let's give, for example, a width of 60 pixels to the div. This is how it is going to be displayed. Let's also add a height of 50 pixels, for example, and a padding of 5 pixels. Do you remember what the padding does? Right. It will create a 5 pixels gap between the content and the border. Let's also add a margin of 10 pixels, but only to the top of the element. This is how we do it. And we will have a margin of 10 pixels between the div and the previous element. If we want to add different sizes to the different margins, we don't have to write the whole property for each one of the sides. We can use what we call the shorthand properties. If we want to add a different size for each one of the sides of the margin, we can use this syntax here. It goes top, right, bottom, left. We can also use that other one if what we want to do is to have a different size in the top and bottom margins, but the same one in the right and left ones. And this other one to add the same size to the top and bottom margin and a different one to the right and left. Let's now see the characteristics of the inline elements. They are displayed horizontally, one next to the other. The height and width are ignored. We can apply margins, but only to the left and to the right, and same thing with the padding, only paddings to the left and the right. The span element is one example of inline element, and this is how it is going to be shown by default. What we have seen is the default display for each type of element, but we can modify that using the display CSS property. Let's see how to do it. Let's see the different values we can give to the display property. We have display block and display inline that display the elements as we have already seen. Then we have inline block. This one displays the elements as a block, but one next to the other, meaning that it can be displayed as an inline element, but without the restrictions of inline elements. So it can have a height, a width, and a top and bottom margin and paddings. This is a pretty interesting one. Then we have display table. With this property, the element is displayed as a table, meaning its content can be displayed in rows and cells. HTML has its own tags to create tables. With display table and display cell, what we do is we emulate those elements. We will see how to create tables later. Then we have display flex and display grid. Those are two more recent additions to CSS, and they are complex position and layout systems that require additional markup and style. They are very interesting position and layout systems, but they are outside of the scope of this course. Maybe we will see a little, very little about flex boxes when we talk about positioning and layout, but this is it. If you want to know more about that, there is a lot of good resources out there. Another very useful property is display none. With this one, the element is not shown. We use that a lot in combination with JavaScript to hide an element that is going to be shown later. For example, we hide an image that is going to appear when we click a button. We will see how to do that when we get into JavaScript. This property is very similar to another one, visibility hidden. The difference is that with display none, the element is removed from the DOM. The element does not exist in the document. And with visibility hidden, the element is not shown, but is there. It's like transparent, like invisible. It is there, but we don't see it. Let's see an example of how to use the display property. We have the box class with the display property set to inline block and a margin, a height, and a width. Now, if we apply that class to some div elements, they are going to be displayed one next to the other and maintaining the width, height, and margins set in the class. What we have done here is modify the default display for the div element that is of the type block, meaning that by default they will be displayed stacked vertically, one below the other. And we are done with all the CSS I wanted to cover before getting into position and layout. I know it has been a lot of content, but they are concepts that are very important to know well if we want to avoid headaches when we get into positioning and layout. So I really think it was the time and the effort. Now let's move into Visual Studio Code and apply what we have learned. Let's open the terminal, Ctrl-J if you are in Windows and Command-J if you're on Mac, and now open the index.html file by typing open index.html. Let's go to the browser and see what we have. Just a bunch of text. What we want to do now is to add an ID to each one of the sections so that we can identify them and apply the styles as we need them. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code and start adding those IDs. Bio, skills, timeline. One thing here, IDs and classes can only have one word, so if we need to use two words for the name, what we do by convention is to add a hyphen between the two words. I'm going to leave it without the hyphen. The next section is the portfolio, and then we'll have contact. What I like to do when I start working on the layout of a page is to visually identify each one of the sections of that page. This way I can make sure that I'm creating the correct layout. To do so, I like to add a different background color to each one of the sections. Later I'm going to remove that color, of course. So let's move to our style sheet and start creating those CSS rules. You can click on that little icon here to split the screen so you can have the HTML and the CSS code side by side, which is pretty useful. Our CSS file is already added to the HTML, so we can start adding the styles. To add a color to the background, we use the background color property. As you can see here, IntelliSense is showing us properties that match what we type, which is pretty useful. And here we have a list of colors, so we can choose one. Let's do the same for the skills ID and for the timeline. Here though, we are going to add the color in another way. We have seen that besides the color name, we can use the hexadecimal code, remember? The thing is, where do we get that code from? There are basically two options. You can use Google to search for the code, or we can use Web DevTools, which is my favorite choice. Let's go to the browser and open Web DevTools. Remember F12 if you're on Windows and Command Option I if you're on Mac. Let's select one section, the skills one for example, and in the bottom part of the window you can see the CSS code for that section. Click on the color and a color picker appears. Here you can see the hexadecimal code for the color we have selected, or we can select any other color we want. With those little arrows here, we can change the way we select the color. In that case, instead of using the hexadecimal code, we are using the quantity of each color, the quantity of color red, green, and blue that compose the color we want. And that last number here is the opacity, is how transparent we want that color to be. Let's choose one and use it in our CSS. Let's paste it here. And look, now if we click on the color, Visual Studio Code shows a color picker, which is a pretty handy thing. We can add the fourth parameter here, which is the opacity. This is optional. The default value is 1, so if we don't add it, no degree of transparency is going to be applied. Let's make it 0.5. And here is how the color is applied to our selector. Here in Web DevTools, we can play around with the values of the opacity to see how they affect the color. 1 is 100% opaque and 0 is 100% transparent, meaning we see nothing. Remember that the changes we do here in Web DevTools are not applied to the code. This is something just to play around in the browser. Those changes are not saved anywhere. Just keep this in mind. Let's add the background color to the rest of the sections, also to the footer. One thing here. Instead of background color, we can use the background property. This is a more generic property because we can set here other things affecting the background besides the color. We will see more about that property later, just letting you know that you can also use it and it's perfectly correct. Now let's add the background color to the header, to the nav, and let me change that to background color too, just for consistency. Let's open the browser, and here we can see each one of the sections with its background color. All those elements are block elements, so by default they have the height of the content and a width of the 100% of the parent's width. We can modify this and we will do it later. As you can see, there is some space between the sections. This is because browsers have a default style applied to some elements, such as the headings. Here, if I select the headings, you can see that they have a margin. The margin is the orange area on top and bottom of the element. Let's go to Visual Studio and set the margin for all those headings to 0 and see what happens. The space between some of the sections has disappeared, along with the space between the headings, but there is still some spaces there. What do you think is causing it? Right, the P element, the paragraph. It has a margin, and we can remove that margin, but if we remove it, what will happen is that the space between the paragraphs is going to disappear, and we don't want that because we want our paragraphs to be separated, right? So what do you think we can do? As the problem is that the bottom margin of the paragraph doesn't have room inside the parent div and then it overflows it, what we can do is give it that space it needs. How can we do that? By adding a padding to the parent element. So let's go to our CSS file and add a padding of 15 pixels to all the sections, including the footer, the header, and the navigation. I'm doing it by grouping all the selectors, but we also can create a class and then add that class to each one of the elements we want to modify, to each one of the elements we want to add the padding to. Let's go to the browser, refresh, and here it is, no spaces between the sections. Let me show you how to add a border to an HTML element. Let's add it, for example, to the nav element. We use the border property and give it a value for the size in pixels, the style, in that case is solid, but it can be also dotted or dashed, and the color. You can also add a border only to one of the sides of the element using border top, border bottom, border right, or border left. And this is how it's shown in the browser. Now I'm going to remove that because we don't need it. That was just to show you how to use the border property. And let's move to the next thing I want you to know. As I have said, all those additional spaces we have now modified were there because browsers have some default styles defined. And those styles are different from one browser to another. A common practice is to do what we call a CSS reset. This is adding some styles that will remove the styles added by the browser. This is not mandatory though. This is just a common practice to have more control about how things are going to be rendered by the browser. If you decide to add a reset, you can create those styles yourself, or you can use a set of styles already created by somebody else. Maybe the most popular of those reset styles is the one created by Danny Meyer, and this is the one we are going to use. Let's go to Danny Meyer website and browse the reset CSS page. Here we have the reset styles created by Danny. Let's copy it and paste it in a new CSS file in our project. I will call it reset CSS. You can also paste it at the beginning of the style CSS file, but I prefer to do it in a separate file because everything looks more clear and tidy. Now we have to add the reset CSS file to the HTML file. Very important, we have to add it before the style CSS file because Google needs to override some of those styles set by the reset CSS file. And as you might remember, styles added below others override the ones above. Let me show you another way of adding additional CSS files. In that case, it is added in the main CSS file, and we use the import annotation. This is the syntax. Let's remove it from the HTML file because it doesn't need to be there anymore. Now we can remove the rule we created to add a margin 0 to the headings because this is already done by the reset CSS file. But Google leave the padding because this is set to 0 in the reset and we want to keep it. And this is how we see it in the browser. As you can see, even the font size of the headings has been removed. If you think that resetting everything is too much, there is still another option. This is using something similar to a reset, but that instead of resetting all the styles, what it does is that it sets a default style for all the browsers. But this style is better than the one that the browser set, and what is more important, is the same for all the browsers. The most popular of those sets of styles is called Normalize, and this is the one we are going to see. Let's go to Normalize website, and here I'm going to show you another very interesting way of adding external CSS files to our website. And this is using a CDN service. The only thing we have to do is to copy the CDN URL and use it in the href attribute of the link meta tag in our HTML file. As you can see, instead of downloading the CSS file to our project or copy-pasting the code, what we are doing here is using the external CSS file from a remote server. Using a CDN is my favorite way of adding external libraries or CSS files, basically for two reasons. As you don't have to download anything, installing it's a straightforward process, and the other one is speed. If you load the CSS file or whatever file you are loading from a CDN server, it's going to load faster than if you do it from your server or your hosting company. And this is very important when you are working with large projects. Let's now go to the browser, and this is how our code is rendered using Normalize. And Normalize is what we are going to use. So you can remove the reset CSS file from your project because we are not going to need it anymore. And we are finally done with all those previous concepts I wanted you to know before getting into positioning and layout. So thanks for watching, and see you in the next video where we are going to get into positioning right away.